1941, Ohio. Mark's workshop lay in the shadows of factory chimneys and sparse street lamps. Puddles smelled of kerosene, and the faint glow from neighboring windows barely pierced the darkness. Evening radio crackled with another war report. Maps of foreign lands, distant soldiers, abstract losses. To most, it was numbers and images. To Mark, it was a reason to finish a pencil stroke on his drawing. He was slender, his hands scarred from old experiments and failures. As a child, he had been told, "Don't meddle in someone else's craft." Whenever he tried to fix a neighbor's toy, he obediently worked in the agricultural tools repair arsenal, but at heart, he was a romantic mechanic. He saw lines and trajectories, heard the whisper of air, and believed every bullet's movement could be written like a poem. His ideas were not born of anger or ambition. They came from instinct, a mix of fear and responsibility. Reports of snipers approaching homes conjured vivid images in his mind. Mothers hiding their children. Soldiers unable to see each other even at a distance. He thought, if one could increase distance, change trajectory, one could save lives, or at least give those left behind a fighting chance. In his drawings, his rifle was called the Long Reach. The name was not for glory. It was a mathematical attempt to capture an idea. Reduce recoil, increase initial speed, stabilize bullet rotation, alter barrel profile, select ammunition that wouldn't drift in the air. Mark knew many elements he devised were considered impossible or too expensive for mass production. But he wasn't aiming for mass production. He was aiming for one perfect, handcrafted weapon that would prove possibility. Nights in the workshop felt like another dimension. A single lamp, the creak of an old chair spring, the scent of solvent. Mark polished barrels to a mirror shine, adjusted bolts as if a heart were hidden inside, and sorted cartridges like sheet music by mass, fit, and shape. He experimented with bullet forms and powders, added tiny grooves, adjusted millimeter marks on fittings. Every evening, he recorded new numbers in a notebook thicker than his childhood favorite book. He didn't see just mechanical problems in his experiments. He saw a story, a long line of human stubbornness, where one man in a cold workshop refused to accept the word impossible. His neighbor, Joe, a mechanic from the next workshop, called him a dreamer and joked while listening to Mark's explanations. "You're trying to invent a whistle for bullets, Mark. They don't listen." "A bullet can be taught to listen," Mark replied without pause. "You just have to speak its language." Spring of 1942 brought blurred promises. Mark drove to a neighboring town where official trials were held for inventions that might interest the Army. He brought the Long Reach in a wooden crate, hand-assembled, with a notebook full of sketches and calculations. The testing hall was dim. The faces of officials were tight as masks. The first trials turned into a routine of small humiliations. Captain Hobbs from the arsenal held the rifle and shook his head. "Too bulky," he muttered, flipping through the blueprints without seeing the millimeter-level solutions Mark had bled nights over. Two female analysts recorded readings without looking up. The room smelled of cheap tobacco and indifference, and yet the Long Reach proved it existed. At ranges where the standard rifle missed by dozens of meters, Mark's bullet hit the target. It wasn't a miracle. It was numbers, consistent groupings, repeatability, minimal variance. One assistant, a young technician, leaned in and whispered to Mark, "If a unit had this, they control the fields." Bureaucracy, however, moved by its own rules. Reports had to pass through departments, each adding notes like unsuitable or too costly to standardize. Officials feared innovation, afraid a new standard would wreck their benchmarks and jeopardize funding. Then came the betrayal Mark least expected. Joe, his neighbor and fellow mechanic, the one Mark thought a friend, saw opportunity. After hearing Captain Hobbs mention a possible contract, Joe quietly contacted a local manufacturer and offered to produce some parts at scale, on the condition his name appeared on the paperwork. Joe had long resented that Mark rarely shared credit and preferred to work alone. When Mark learned Joe had signed a preliminary agreement without telling him, it felt like a stab. His prototype could be cannibalized into a soulless commodity, stripped of the fine-tuning only he could provide. He stormed to Joe, eyes cold as iron. "You stole the chance," he said. "Worse, you stole the meaning." "I'm not a thief," Joe snapped back. I see possibilities. You don't want our shop to rot. But it wasn't about the shop. Mark realized bureaucracy would sell the idea faster than it would honor its creator. If he wanted to keep what he'd made, he'd need protection beyond drawings, legal, public attention, something to anchor authorship. He returned home exhausted and made a simple decision. Work harder, retreat into solitude, and refine the rifle until no contract alone could determine the long reach's fate. He grew pedantic, logging every part, testing different powders, marking test dates in bold. Inside him grew the sense that more than recognition was at stake. This was about whether his idea would retain its face in a world that loved quick, easy solutions. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe honesty, but it was his choice. Summer of 1942. The air was thick, metallic, as if the whole country vibrated, preparing for war. Factories ran around the clock, sparks flying from windows. Amid this chaos, Mark squeezed in with his mad project, hiding from the world a rifle he now regarded as almost alive. He knew that if someone stole the idea, only emptiness would remain. So he began working on a special type of bullet, one the military could not easily replicate, a projectile capable of stabilizing over record distances. Not massive, not armor-piercing, slightly elongated, with a thin balanced groove at the base. When it left the barrel, it seemed to listen to the air. Months went into perfecting its center of gravity. Dozens of failed shots were logged. At 1,100 yards, dropped 4.7 inches. At 1,311.2, losing velocity too fast. All done manually, in solitude. At night, he drove out of town, to places where no one could hear the shots. 10 targets near an abandoned elevator, moonlight casting long shadows. Wind sometimes threw trajectory off, echoes muffled the report. But one night, when the moon hung low, he heard only a click, then the metallic ring of a perfect hit. The bullet struck dead center. Distance, 1,500 meters. No one in America had reached that far before. He stood, looking through the scope, a strange mix of triumph and horror in his chest. He realized his invention could not only change the war, it could redefine the very concept of war itself. The next morning, he locked away all notes, covered the rifle, and avoided it for days. Dreams haunted him, his weapon hitting its mark, but he could never see who was on the other side. Yet the war waited for no man's doubts. Within a week, a letter arrived at his workshop, bearing the seal of the U.S. Army, an invitation to Virginia for classified trials of new firearms, signed by Colonel Rivers, a name he hadn't known before. But the tone left no room for refusal. Virginia, the military range, rows of targets, concrete and steel, smell of kerosene and diesel. Mark arrived with his wooden crate, feeling as if he had transported a piece of his soul. Colonel Rivers met him, tall, iron-willed smile, and Lieutenant Baker, young, already judging everything as a toy. "Show it," said the colonel curtly. Mark assembled a rifle, hands precise as scalpels. All eyes on him, some curious, others coldly amused. Cameras rolled. Engineers scribbled in notebooks. The first shot silenced the crowd. The bullet passed through 2 wind layers and struck steel exactly at the aim point. The second shot repeated it. Technical metrics confirmed what Mark already knew. Grouping, stability, extraordinary range. Baker tried to mask surprise. The colonel's face stayed a professional mask. Just another day at work. After the demonstration, the bargaining began. The Army offered money, authority, and factory capacity. But the black envelope the colonel handed Mark carried terms. Transfer of rights, complete confidentiality, inclusion of manufacturing partners on the list. In other words, effectively stripping Mark of authorship and control. In that moment, Mark saw 3 things at once. The iron logic of the military machine. It moved fast and without romance. Joe's face in his memory, the one who'd already tried to profit, and his notebook of sleepless nights where long reach had become a point of pride rather than a pile of parts. He understood, sign, and the idea would go mass-produced, maybe save lives, while he remained in the shadows. Don't sign, and they might copy it or launch an improved version that replaces solutions with cheaper substitutions, killing the rifle's soul. The colonel spoke calmly, We must think in tens of thousands. Standardization is soldier safety. Baker added, "Sign, Mark. You'll be able to oversee tests. You'll be part of the team." Mark gripped the pen. He wasn't an idealist for the sake of ideals. He was practical, but sometimes principle outweighed contract. In his workshop, he never wanted glory. He wanted long reach to work where it was needed, in hands that understood the price of distance. He took the envelope without opening it and walked to the edge of the range. There, where the wind was stronger, he thumbed through his notebook and reread lines of midnight calculations and tiny tweaks. In his head, there was a hollow sound, the footsteps of a machine that could crush a single man for the sake of broader efficiency. He returned and said, "I need time." It wasn't a refusal. It was a time he took to decide whether to sell his idea to the world outright or keep control and risk someone stealing it. The colonel nodded, but his eyes were iron. Time is a luxury. We have little. Mark drove back to Ohio feeling sifted. Now, the stake was no longer only test accuracy or ballistic numbers. It was who would decide how his work would be used. Home met him with rain and mud, puddles underfoot, drops on the tin roof. The smell of damp that pulled downward like gravity. He sat at his bench with the notebook, the rifle, and the Virginia envelope. He left it unopened for days. Each time he reached for it, it felt as if he were signing away more than a contract. Something irreversible. On the radio, they talked about Pearl Harbor. America was officially at war. Streets filled with recruitment posters. People turned in scrap metal. Factories switched to wartime lines. He still sat in his shop, not a soldier, not a bureaucrat, not a hero, just a man who created a weapon that could kill at distances where conscience might not catch up. Some nights he went into the yard, set a tin can on the fence, and fired, not for training but for sound. The metal shivered, and the ring in the quiet felt like a reminder. You hit mark, but where? You don't know. He set to work again, took the cover off, checked barrel balance, adjusted the optic mount. Long reach grew more accurate, lighter, and, strangely, more beautiful. Every line and curve had the polish of obsession. He began to write notes not for the army but for himself. The rifle doesn't kill. The person who decides when to pull the trigger does. Give weapons to those who don't feel distance, and you become part of their mistake. A few days later, someone knocked. A man in uniform stood in the doorway with no insignia. Tall, spare, face like cut stone. Mark Whitting? Yes. Sergeant Randall. From Colonel Rivers. He produced a new envelope. Inside, a short note and a photograph. A young soldier lay behind a barricade, a ruined rifle beside him, blood visible. On the back, if he'd hit his target the first time, he would still be alive. Randall said quietly, "The colonel thinks your ideas could have saved men like him." He looked at the rifle on the table. "We don't have a perfect weapon. Maybe you do." The sergeant left the door ajar. Cold air drifted in. Mark stared at the photo and, for the first time in months, could not tell whether this was a plea for help or a subtle form of pressure. He exhaled and realized there was no convenient answer. Either he handed the rifle over so it could live in other hands, or he kept it to prevent his creation from becoming a soulless machine. He sat and wrote on the last page of his notebook. Range is not the point. The point is whose hand holds the trigger. Autumn 1942. The world burned. Soldiers left. Factories roared. Letters in front smelled of smoke and fear. And in a small shop on the edge of Ohio, Mark still lived between two worlds, iron and conscience. One night, he noticed something strange. Someone was standing by the gate, a tall, motionless shadow. When he went outside, no one was there, only tire tracks in the mud. The next day, he realized he was being watched. Maybe the army. Maybe Joe. Maybe both. The mailbox started bringing empty envelopes. The phone rang briefly, then fell silent. He began locking the workshop, hiding his blueprints, even removing the optics from long reach and storing them separately. Paranoia? Perhaps. But he had seen ideas stolen, twisted, mass-produced. A couple of weeks later, Joe appeared. "You're still holding on to yours?" he asked at the door. "You have a chance to make history, Mark." "I don't want history. I want someone across the ocean to survive Mark replied. Joe smirked. You won't save anyone by hiding what can shoot farther than anyone else. Someone else will do it if you don't. The Army is already working on their prototype. Without you, Mark understood, the time had run out. That night, he took the rifle, fully assembled, and went out of town. The wind was sharp, stars bright, the sky low. He placed a new target, an old tin can on a hill. The goal, almost a mile. Breath held, finger on the trigger. The shot rang out, a sound like thunder in a vacuum. The target vanished. He lowered the rifle and stared long into the emptiness where nothing remained. No cans, no distance. Perhaps the best shot of his life, and the heaviest. In that second, he realized long reach no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the war. Winter 1943. A telegram arrived without a signature. Only the line, your presence required, Fort Benning. Urgent. Mark went, asking no questions. Inside, everything already burned with the sense that his months-old decision had somehow dragged him back into the same circle. Fort Benning was a bustling anthill. Trucks, infantry, tents, firing ranges. Mark immediately spotted Colonel Rivers. He looked as if he hadn't slept for weeks. "We've deployed your system." Rivers said no introduction. "It works." Mark froze. "Which system?" "Your rifle. Long reach. Prototype. Modified." The colonel handed him a folder of photos. Snipers in snowy Italian mountains. Rifles resembling his. Engagement ranges over 1,200 meters. "They call it LR1 Whitting model." Mark stared. His weapon, but not his. Different optics, crude, standard bullets, slightly thicker rifle. But in every curve, he recognized himself. One photo bore the name. Corporal Daniel Hayes, confirmed 37 kills. "They kill," he said quietly. "Yes." Rivers nodded. "And they save. Your calculations work perfectly." Mark remained silent. Pride? He should have felt it. Instead, he felt as though he were watching his child serve in someone else's hands. Later in the armory, he touched one of the rifles, cold metal, familiar yet impersonal. He ran his finger along the barrel like an old scar. A sergeant whispered nearby, "This thing changes the game. Our guys call it the bullet that sees farther." He sat on a crate, eyes closed. All the nights, sketches, doubts. Everything he had lived for now shot somewhere on another continent, in the hands of people he would never meet. Rivers found him again. "We want you to go to Europe. As an instructor, help refine the system, train teams." Mark looked out the window. Snow gleamed beyond the base. Planes roared toward the Atlantic. He realized. Refuse, and his weapon would remain in the field regardless. Go. And he could at least ensure it didn't become just a statistical tool. He exhaled. "All right, but I'm not going as a soldier." "As what?" Rivers asked. "As someone who still remembers why it all began." Spring 1944. Northern France. Gray sky. The smell of smoke and wet iron. Mark stepped off a Douglas transport. Boots caked with dust. His official title was simple, ballistics consultant. But everyone knew who he was. People looked at him with a mix of respect, curiosity, and quiet fear. At the field warehouse, he saw dozens of LR-1 rifles, neatly stacked like soldiers in formation. Their barrels gleamed like cold glass. Each one held a piece of his nights, his formulas, his hands. Now those pieces were weapons. At the firing range, he observed young snipers. A 20-year-old, face still unshaped by war, aim at 1,200 yards. The bullet struck precisely in the center. Mark noticed a tremor in the soldier's hands. Not fear, but the realization that he had just hit someone at a distance where a human is already just a dot on the horizon. "Good work," Mark said. The soldier smiled. "This is all your long-reach lady, sir." Mark flinched. Long-reach lady. The soldiers had named his rifle as if it were a living being. But with every shot came reports, names, distances, dates. By the second week, he realized that all these reports were just lists of the dead, written neatly. One night, a squad returned to camp. One sniper didn't speak, simply wiping blood from the bolt. What happened? Mark asked. I saw his face in the scope, the soldier whispered. Aimed too long. He looked straight at me before the shot. Looked at you, sir. Your rifle isn't about distance. It's about seeing death closer than you want. That phrase haunted Mark. A week later, he was summoned to headquarters. Rivers was there, older, with dark circles under his eyes. We want to conduct a precise operation. Long-range shot. Target. A Wehrmacht officer. Artillery coordinator. Distance 1.2 miles. Only long reach can do it. And who shoots? Mark asked. You. It wasn't a request. It was an order. Yet inside he resisted. He had created the weapon to help those further away, not to become a killer. But in that moment, he realized a creator cannot remain a bystander. He agreed. Night. Dim moonlight. Silent field. Wind steady, almost perfect. Mark lay on position, cheek against the stock. In the scope, a light in the bunker window. A shadow of a man. He inhaled. Trigger pulled. The sound receded, dissolved. Silence. Then a brief flash. The window light vanished. He felt no triumph. Only emptiness. The bullet, flying 1.2 miles, was not seen by his eyes but by some inner echo. That bullet passed through everything, air, calculations, doubt, conscience, and left a hole the same shape somewhere in his soul. Summer 1944 wore a strange weight. Mark sat in his small bunk room at the camp, notebook on his knees, pencil trembling in his fingers. The battlefields around him were torn roads and smoking ruins. Reports arrived of men who would never return. His long reach worked, devastatingly precise. But the more he watched his effects, the clearer it became. His invention changed more than range. It shifted moral ground. Through the scope, soldiers saw slivers of other lives where before there had been only shapes. Each shot became a choice between death and a miss. He watched how people treated the rifle. Privates spoke of it almost reverently, as if it were alive. Others looked at it with horror. He understood he had handed men a tool that could save or take a life with a single pull, and now he carried responsibility for every target hit. One evening a young sniper approached him. You built this rifle?" the boy asked. "Yes," Mark whispered. "It killed my brother," the soldier said, voice cracking. "And it saved my friend. I don't know what to call you." Mark had no answer. Words felt useless. Only a hollow weight of decision. Genius, he realized, is not measured by wins, but by the lives it touches and the scars it leaves. That night he wrote, "By creating range, I gave the power to see death earlier than needed. The cost is conscience, not measurable in inches or yards." He looked at the rifle tucked in the corner, cold, gleaming, perfectly accurate. It wasn't his anymore. It belonged to the war. With it went part of him. The world shifted, and so did Mark. He was no longer just a craftsman from Ohio. He had become a man whose tool could alter battles. But that achievement came with nightmares and lasting doubt. As the war edged toward an end, Europe lay exhausted. American snipers with long reach had played their part. Mark returned to Ohio, tired, changed, hollowed out, but with a sense that his work had left a mark. Back in the workshop where it all began, the rifle lay on a bench, wrapped in canvas. He ran his fingers over the metal, remembering every shot, from first experiments to operations in Italy and France. His notebook brimmed with entries, calculations, and observations. Looking through them, he understood one thing: making the impossible exact a price. That price was personal, his peace, his conscience, his quiet nights. But there was another side, the chance to save the lives of those who trusted his invention. With long reach, a new era of American sniping had begun. Many would never know Mark's name, but they knew the precision with which men fought. His idea, once deemed madness, had become legend. He never sought fame. He wanted only to push what was possible. He had done it. The world saw results, hits, ranges, victories. Mark knew the cost of each. Somewhere in his workshop, among drawings and steel parts, a piece of his soul remained, with the long reach. Mark locked the workshop and stepped outside into the sunlight for the first time in years. The wind was gentle light, as if life itself reminded him. The impossible is possible, but only when someone is willing to pay the price. The war was winding down. Soldiers were returning, but Europe was a scarred landscape of smoke and rubble. Factories had pivoted back to civilian work, yet the echoes of guns still haunted streets and fields. Mark felt the weight of everything he had set in motion. The long reach had changed not only battles, but the very way men saw each other across distance. At night, he still found himself testing the rifle. Not for war, not for glory. For the sound of the shot, the vibration of metal against metal, the quiet proof that his hands had done what only imagination could dream. Each bullet carried his obsession. Geometry, physics, intuition, and a relentless hunger to prove that limits were meant to be tested. Sometimes he walked to the hills near the workshop, placing a tin can on a fence post. The wind cut across his face. The earth smelled of rain and soil. He fired. The sound resonated in the silence, a single note between man and world. He felt the precision, the pull, the physics obeying his calculations. And he imagined the soldiers far away, whose lives had been touched by his work, unknown to him, faceless yet real. Mark became increasingly meticulous. Every component was measured, tested, adjusted. He experimented with new powders, bullet shapes, balance, rifling. Each improvement was logged with obsessive care. He knew the rifle could no longer just exist. It had to remain unmatched in human hands, a tool of exactness that bureaucracy could not replicate. Letters and occasional visitors reminded him that the world had not forgotten. Soldiers, officers, and engineers sent questions, requests, or veiled threats. Mark realized that control had become a responsibility heavier than any rifle. He was no longer just mechanic or dreamer. He was the keeper of consequences, the silent architect of death and survival. He also faced ghosts. Joe's betrayal lingered like rust on metal. Some days Mark imagined the rifle in the wrong hands, mass-produced, soulless. Each vision sharpened his obsession with perfection, with absolute control. Every shot he made alone was a silent counterpoint to the chaos he feared might spread from his creation. Yet there were moments of odd peace. When the wind stilled and sunlight fell in thin lines across the workshop, Mark saw the beauty in engineering, in the flow of a bullet, in the quiet satisfaction of a handcrafted tool performing flawlessly. The long reach was not just a weapon. It was proof of human persistence, stubbornness, and devotion. And always, the war continued to echo in his mind. Europe, Asia, oceans, deserts. The rifle had already traveled where he could not, reshaping lives, shortening distances, stretching consequences. He understood that his invention had transcended the workshop, the man, and even the intention. It existed as both tool and symbol, precise yet merciless. Mark finally sat down, pen in hand, and wrote, "Every shot is not just a calculation. It is a choice. Every bullet that flies carries a trace of the hand that made it, and every choice will echo far beyond the horizon." Spring 1944, northern France. The air was heavy with smoke and the smell of wet iron. Mark stepped off the transport Douglas, boots caked with dust, the gravel crunching beneath. His official title read ballistics consultant, but everyone around him knew the truth. He was a man who had crafted a rifle that could redefine distance, precision, and consequence. At the field depot, rows of LR-1 rifles gleamed like disciplined soldiers. Each barrel reflected the pale sunlight, each stock carved with invisible traces of Mark's obsession. Every weapon was a fragment of his nights, his sleepless calculations, his meticulous hands, now transformed into tools of war. He observed young snipers at the range. A boy, barely 20, aimed at a target 1,200 yards away. The rifle sang, and the bullet struck dead center. Mark noted the slight tremor in the soldier's hand. Not fear, but the all-connecting mathematics with life and death. "Good work," he said softly. The boy smiled. "It's all your long-range lady, sir." The name made Mark flinch. Soldiers had given life to his creation, naming it as if it were alive. Reports followed every shot, name, distance, date. By the second week, Mark realized these were not just statistics. They were records of death, formatted neatly in ink. One night, a squad returned silently. A sniper did not speak, only white blood from his bolt. Mark asked, "What happened?" The soldier replied quietly. I saw his face through the scope. Too long. I looked directly at him. Your rifle isn't about distance, sir. It's about seeing death closer than you want to. The words haunted him. Then came the order. Rounds of intelligence indicated a target far behind enemy lines. An officer coordinating artillery. Distance, 1.25 miles. Only the long reach could manage the shot. And the shooter? Mark. He felt the weight of responsibility crush him. He had built this rifle to assist, not to kill directly. Yet in that moment, he understood the truth. Being a creator meant you could not always remain a spectator. He agreed, reluctantly, with a gnawing sense of moral tension. Night fell. The field was quiet, the moon dim, the wind steady. Mark lay prone, cheek pressed to the stock. Through the scope, he saw a light in the window, the shadow of a man. Breath held, calculations running through his mind. Finger on the trigger. He fired. The shot traveled, silent in his perception, though the air carried it far. A flash, a disappearance of light. The target neutralized. Mark did not feel triumph. Only an empty, hollow echo of the bullet's passage, through air, through calculations, through doubt, through conscience. And somewhere inside him, a matching void formed. The long reach was no longer just a creation. It had left the workshop. It belonged to the world, to war, and a part of Mark had gone with it. Summer 1944. Mark sat in his small room at the camp, notebook on his knees, pencil trembling in his fingers. Around him, the battlefield sprawled. Torn roads, smoldering ruins, reports of soldiers who would never return. His long reach worked flawlessly, lethally precise. Yet with every successful shot, the weight of its consequences pressed heavier on him. He watched the soldiers' reactions. Some revered the rifle almost as if it were alive. Others feared it. He understood. He had given humans a tool that could save or end life in a single pull of the trigger, and now he bore responsibility for each decision made through his invention. One night, a young sniper approached him. You made this rifle? Yes, Mark replied softly. It killed my brother and saved my friend. I don't know how to make you feel about it. Words failed. Only emptiness and the gravity of choice remained. He realized genius was measured not by triumphs alone, but by the lives touched and the scars left behind. That night, he wrote in his notebook, in creating range, I gave the ability to see death sooner than one should. The cost is a conscience that cannot be measured in inches or yards. He looked at the rifle standing in the corner, cold, gleaming, perfect. It no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the war. And with it, a piece of Mark. The world changed, and Mark changed with it. He was no longer simply a craftsman from Ohio. He was the man who had created a tool capable of altering outcomes, at the expense of peace within himself. As the war neared its end, Europe lay exhausted and broken. American snipers with the long reach had played their role. Mark returned to Ohio, weary, altered, hollowed, yet aware that his work had left a mark. Back in his workshop, where it had all begun, the rifle lay on the table, carefully wrapped. Mark ran his fingers along the metal, remembering every shot, the early experiments, the trials in Italy and France. His notebook overflowed with notes, calculations, observations. He understood one truth clearly. Creating the impossible always carries a cost. A personal cost, his peace, his conscience, his quiet nights. Yet, with it came the potential to save lives of those who trusted his invention. The long reach marked the beginning of a new era in American sniping. Few knew Mark's name, but they knew the precision with which soldiers fought. What had started as madness became legend. He never sought fame. He only wanted to build a tool that expanded the limits of what was possible, and he did. The world saw the results. Precise shots, extended distances, victories. But Mark knew the price of every one. Somewhere in his workshop, among the blueprints and steel, part of his soul remained, with the long reach. He locked the workshop for the first time in years, and stepped outside into the sunlight. The wind was soft, light, as if life itself reminded him, the impossible is possible, but only if a person is willing to pay the price. The end. If you enjoyed the story, subscribe to the channel, give a like, and hit the bell to never miss a new video. Leave a comment telling us which story you'd like to see next.